Well, Marcia, tell us, when did you first acquire an interest in dyslexia?
Well, I knew about dyslexia in the early days of dyslexia. My brother is severely dyslexic, and he was tested in Rochester, Minnesota in 1947. He was the third student tested by Paula Rome when she came to Rochester in 1946, and he was having a lot of trouble in second grade, and my father always said, oh, it's okay because boys are slower. And so all along in high school, or grade school and high school, I knew my brother had a lot of trouble, but I didn't really focus on it. I'm 5 years older, and he was just my little brother. After college and after my marriage, I was expecting my first child, and that was in 1959. So I wanted something to do that was part-time. So I called Paula Rome and asked if perhaps I could start working or tutoring or doing something at the reading center. And she said, oh, we need another tutor. There were only 2 tutors there at the time, Jean Osmond and Mrs. Saltzman, Muriel Saltzman. And she said, please come on board. And I said, but I don't know how to teach reading. And she said, that's okay, I will teach you. So that was my beginning in the field of dyslexia.
Now, so that's when you began in the field.
Exactly.
Right when Lisa was born.
Right, right.
Wonderful.
53 years ago.
Yeah. And so with which schools and organizations and clinics and so on have you been associated then in all these years?
Well, for the first 15 years, I was working at the Reading Center. I was a master teacher at the very first summer 3-week session, training session in Rochester in 1967. Might have been 66, and we had people in our class like Arlene Sonde, Mary Lee Enfield, Wilson Anderson, and so I became associated with those people. While I was working at the Reading Center, I held a part-time language arts position in a small town, Pine Island, Minnesota. I taught at a psychiatric center for adolescents, many of whom had dyslexia. And so then I moved on. I moved to California. I taught at a community college. And then I did my graduate work at Stanford and became associated with San Jose State University.
And what is it about your work that you find the most interesting and the most challenging?
Well, there are 2 things. The first joy of my life is teaching. And I love, even while I'm teaching adults and doing, graduate classes, I love working with children. So now that I'm retired, I am a volunteer tutor at our little 2-room school on Madeline Island where I live. Probably the other thing that was most interesting was in my classes, I taught first at Santa Clara University and then at San Jose State. Every student, I think, almost every student I had were taking graduate level to get a master's degree in learning disabilities. And they would, as I was teaching the structure of the language, the history of written English and so on, they would say, why haven't I learned this? Why hasn't this been a part of my undergraduate teaching? I'm not prepared to work with struggling readers. So that has always been an interest and a challenge.
And do you work with other professionals in the field, and in what capacity?
Absolutely. I mean, I think the joy of being an IDA member is, for so many years, I first joined in at Paula's urging in 1968, and I've met fabulous people in this field, and I've learned so much from them. People like Norm Geschwind and Margaret Rawson and Roger Saunders, and of course my mentor, Paula Rome. So it's so helpful to have all these wide connections. I've often turned to you and asked you for advice, and you know, we have a difficult student, and so we have other people who become our support system. So that's been very important.
And besides Paula Rome, who were some of your other mentors?
I had two other really important mentors. One was Paula's associate, Jean Osman, who is still a close friend and colleague. And Jean was the first employee of Paula's in Rochester. And Jean was actually the one, after Paula got me started, to follow through and became kind of my direct supervisor. And the other mentor was my major professor at Stanford, Bob Kelfie. And he had an interesting background. He was primarily an experimental psychologist, but he became fascinated with children who couldn't learn to read. And so he took another interest in linguistics, psycholinguistics, and the teaching of reading. So he just broadened my knowledge so much.
And do you have any specific students or clients that you recall, and what are your remembrances?
I have lots of students. I could probably spend the rest of our time talking about them, but probably the two that I remember most. The first one was a little boy, my very first student, and I was learning along with this little boy named Lad. And Paula said to me, the joy of teaching one-on-one is that you start where the child is. It's not like a classroom full of children where everybody has to be kind of on the same page. And she said, now his name is Lad, so of course we'll talk about the consonants L and D and their corresponding sounds, and we'll present the short A because that's the vowel in his name. But if his name was Tim, we would teach the T and the M and their corresponding sounds and the short I. And Lad was just a joy to work with. When I met him, he was in second grade. He spelled his name L-A-B, and all the letters were, even the L and the A were written backwards. My other student was a brilliant boy. Margaret Rawson had tested him. He was 12 years old. It was when I was in California. He had an IQ of 172 on the Stanford Binet, genius level, and his spelling was like that of a second grader. And Margaret had tested him because his father was one of her students in her school at Rose Valley study. And she insisted that I take him, and I said, Margaret, at this point in my life, I was doing my dissertation. I said, I can't take him. And she said, you have to take him. So I did, and he was a joy to work with. And the wonderful thing is that he now has a bookstore in San Francisco that's very successful. So here's a child who had great difficulty with reading and primarily with spelling, and he's kind of gone where he's wanted to in life.
What attracted you toward what was then Orton Society?
Well, Paula pushing, I would say. She wanted all of us at the Reading Center to be members, and she was at that time, in the mid to late 60s, the president of the Upper Midwest branch, which was one of the first chartered branches of IDA, then the Orton Society. And I became very involved. In 1974, the Orton Society was having its 25th anniversary. And the Mayo Clinic invited the Orton Society to come to Rochester, and they would co-sponsor, they did co-sponsor the 25th anniversary meeting. And it was a wonderful time. I met people like McDonald Critchley of the World Federation of Neurology, Loretta Bender, the great psychologist, a dyslexic psychologist, Mrs. Orton, and I had actually moved to California, but I came back for that meeting because I'd been on the planning committee and before I moved. And so that was just an extraordinary event.
So how long have you been involved in with IDA?
Since 1968,
Okay.
so over about 35 years.
Yeah, and in what capacity? Tell us all about the jobs you've had in IDA.
Oh dear. My memory is still working. I was the secretary of the Upper Midwest branch in the late 60s and early 70s. And then I moved to California and became interested and active in the Northern California branch, became president of that. And that was really when I started getting interested at the national level, because I went to branch council as Northern California branch president and met so many more wonderful people that are still my friends for life. And then I became branch council chair, and because of that, I was on the national board, because the branch council chair is a member of the board. And so I served on the board for 17 years, from 1980 or 81 through 97. And then I became during that time, I became a vice president and then president-elect. And then I was president from 1992 to 96.
And what were some of the critical issues you faced during your term as IDA president?
Oh, don't ask. There were lots of issues. There were lots of really sad things and then wonderful things. When I became president, we had an absolutely outstanding executive director, Gary Ulrich. And after about 9 months into my term, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And we had worked so closely together, and he was such a great guy to work with. He was communicative. He'd listen to the issues. He would think through them. And when he passed away, we were just at a loss. And then another director came on, and he only stayed with us for a year, and then a third director came on. So during my 4 years, I worked with three different executive directors, and during the transition time, I was teaching full-time at San Jose State, and fortunately, they let me have a lot of time. I flew back here to Baltimore maybe every other month or so, just to try to kind of hold the staff together. So it was a very trying time. There were also some very major issues, the biggest being definition, the definition of dyslexia. We had for years, since 1966 or 68, we used the World Federation of Neurology definition, which was rather broad in scope. And people wanted something a little more definitive and a little more positive. We had a great team spearheaded by Emerson Dickman, who took on the role the New Jersey branch was very active in getting us rethinking the definition. And Emerson, as a member of the branch and is also active in IDA, became the spokesman and kind of the author, at least the drafts of the definition. But the hostility was amazing from people. For instance, a lot of people felt that we were making it so that people, teachers in private schools, where where dyslexia was the key thing, that if we broadened anything to say, spelling difficulties, etc., the other kinds of events that often go along with reading disability, that it would not help their programs. And so there was a great deal of give and take. Some branches were solidly for it, some were solidly against. And so it was a difficult time, but we always seem to weather those times, and now we're all pretty happy with the definition.
And what expertise did board members provide you, and also what expertise did you really miss?
At the time I joined the board, and actually the whole first 10 or 12 years, our board was a little lopsided in terms of, we had a lot of educators. We had college professors, we had heads of private schools, we had very few classroom teachers or people from public school administration. We had very few people of other, for instance, we had one attorney, we had one physician, and that was very helpful. But we needed something a little more rounded. We needed more expertise in some of the business aspects. IDA has never been an affluent organization, and we've weathered some really bad times. I heard Wilson say in his tape that when he became president, which was 4 years before me, that there was something like $345 in the whole bank account. And so we probably could do with people who really have some financial corporate background, but we tend to be an organization of teachers, so that I think is why the board has reflected that.
And what board experience, either with IDA or others, did you have previously to prepare you for the position as president?
Very little. I mean, other than my service on the IDA board, I knew a lot about dyslexia, but I didn't so much know about running an organization. I had been asked when I was at San Jose State to head our learning disabilities department, and I said, oh no, I'm faculty, I teach, I don't administrate. And I think that administrators are so important to an organization, and I didn't feel I had any of those skills. I love working with people, and I'm a good listener, and so I brought those kinds of assets, but I really didn't feel that I had the leadership qualities, perhaps, that might have been beneficial.
And how did your work in the field of dyslexia help you in your job as president?
Well, just the fact that I knew about working with parents, I knew about working with children, I knew the kind of curriculum that would be beneficial to these children, and so I felt that those things were all very important.
And a couple more questions. How has the field changed since you became involved in it?
Oh, it's changed a great deal. Two things particularly come to mind. I remember during my time on the board, and I don't remember precisely, we had a group come in and do surveys, and we would go out and have people from the community come in, and we were asking questions such as, what does dyslexia mean to you? And I know still that there's a lot of people who don't know about dyslexia, to any degree, but I think they know the name. I think they've heard the term. A lot has been written about dyslexia, about important or celebrities and other people who are very prominent in various areas who are dyslexic. So I think that has changed. I think in terms of our approach to teaching children, I think we still go back to the values and the approaches that were identified by Anna Gillingham and her colleague Bessie Stellman based on Dr. Orton's hypotheses. But we've also been able to bring in so much current research that shows what works, and we've been greatly helped by the work of the National Institute of Child Health and Human Services, because they have been able to fund some outstanding research projects. So we just know, we have more evidence, we have scientific-based evidence about the kinds of things that work, which just mesh beautifully with an Orton-Gillingham approach. I guess there's a third thing that comes to mind, and that's the use in our teaching of technology. I am so impressed here. I've just this morning walking by 2 different doors that were open and speakers were speaking, and they were showing iPad apps that kids can use directly as a concept or as a pattern is being taught. Immediately they can put that into play on their iPads. And so all of the technology, to some of us who didn't grow up with that, is just mind-boggling, and it's a little hard to keep up with.
Just a little. Speaking of things like that, Marcia, can you tell us a little bit about your fabulous book and the work that went into it on the history of dyslexia?
Oh, yes, thanks. In 1993, I had a sabbatical from San Jose State for a semester, and 1 month of that I took to go to New York City to Columbia University and look at the Orton archives. And in 1980, the June Day Orton Trust had brought all of Dr. Orton's records, his patient records of children with dyslexia. Thousands of cases were put on microfiche by Columbia. They had also been sent about a dozen boxes of manuscripts, photographs, early school visits that Dr. Orton would make. And Lucia Carnes, who oversaw the trust, said, oh, they've all been inventoried and cataloged, and you'll just have a fine time going through them. Well, when I got there, they couldn't find the boxes of all this rich literature and manuscripts and so on. They couldn't find. And here I'd, come there to study them. So finally, after a week, they said, well, we're looking, but we can't find the boxes. So I called Dr. Maslin, who was a former board member, a member of the Council of Advisors, a wonderful neurologist, who was for years on staff at Columbia. I said, Dr. Maslin, what will I do? And he said, I'll take care of it. I'll get them to find it. Well, come to find out, they finally, the next week, found these boxes in a damp basement in a building about 50 blocks away from the medical center, which is way up about 187th Street. And they were found down by 114th Street. And so they brought them over, and my husband had joined me for this venture. We started going through these boxes, and here were all these carbons and handwritten manuscripts put together by rusty paper clips, and we just couldn't believe it. But it was just such fun going through and finding these wonderful pieces. We found that my husband pulled this out, and he said, look at this. And it was a letter from Dr. Alzheimer in Breslau, Germany, inviting Dr. Orton in 1913 to come join his lab for a year, and which he did. But to find these things was just, we just got goosebumps. And drawings that Orton had made. He was fascinated by left-handers. And he had all these collections of newspapers with pictures of Babe Ruth and Lefty Gomez and all these left-handed golfers. And he drew a picture that is just, it's in the book. It's just a beautiful picture with his initials, STO, of the position that a left-hander should have for the pencil position, the grip, the paper position, versus a right-hander on both sides of the paper. So that was wonderful. Well, then in 1995, whatever the 50th anniversary of the society was 95 or 96, 97. They asked me if I would do this book, and we called it Dyslexia, Samuel Torrey Orton and His Legacy. And I had a wonderful co-editor in Susan Brickley, who was then on the IDA staff. And she went to Swarthmore. I went to the Ethical Culture School in New York. We went back to the Orton archives, which then everything was nicely organized, and just put together this volume with some of the early writings of, for instance, Hinchelwood and Morgan, who were kind of the British pioneers in this, and none of them called it dyslexia. Hinchelwood and Morgan both called it congenital word blindness. Dr. Orton called it strephosymbolia, which means twisted symbols, because of so many of the children were either inverting letters, reversing letters, transposing letters. So he thought strephosymbolia was a perfect term for it. And so that's why we put the book together. We also included kind of a history of the beginnings of the Orton Society, which was formed by June Orton. And then we had all the branches that existed at that time, wrote pieces. We had all the Orton Award winner recipients, and so that's how that book came about.
Thank you so much, Marcia. This has really been a fascinating period of time.
Thank you, Martha.